We are embarking into unknown territory, really.
Now, I'm not necessarily 100% on this.
What is music in comics?
Yes, I did end up with many more than 5.
Oh, well, I can just mention it in an honorable mention. But no, you can't now. We're banning that. You only got 5.
Why don't you kick us off?
Scott Pilgrim.
Johnny Cash, I See a Darkness.
Black Sad, A Silent Hell.
The Fifth Beatle.
Let's see where we go next. Me then, number 3 for me was a no-brainer, and this was the one that popped into my head instantly when we originally talked about it, because I was like, well, that's going to be there.
Right.
Hip Hop Family Tree by Ed Pisco. Now, these are the slipcase versions. There's 2 slipcases with 4 volumes all told, 2 in each. Ed Pisco charts the life of hip-hop as a cultural movement and as a music movement. So essentially, he goes through tons and tons of books and research and tries to verse himself in the history of hip-hop from the late 70s through to the early 80s, and then tries to depict that. Now, I will say that I think after reading The Beats, which was written by Harvey Pekar and drawn by Ed Pisco, has a lot of influence on this, because the approach to writing certainly seems to come from that. And what I mean by that, in a way, is Harvey Pekar in The Beats, because it's such a big story with lots of people in it. He just cuts it down to the bare minimum, the things that really mattered to the beat movement. And that's what we've got here. We've got all of this massive cast of people, and just the end pages will show you, just some of the cast that we are talking about. We're talking about a serious amount of artists and producers and managers and record label owners and record shop owners and graffiti artists and clothes designers and filmmakers, all coming together to make this cultural movement based around the music of hip hop, really. And Ed approaches it by just literally going, right, this is what matters, this is what matters, this is what matters. So sometimes you might just see like a really influential character, for a panel or a page. Sometimes it stays with a group of people for a while. It allows itself to follow the main story of the development of hip hop. So you get people like, Grandmaster Flash. You get people like Cool Herc. James Brown is in there as well in some way. Blondie is in there, because Blondie made a hell of an impact on the hip hop movement as well. But then you've got, Fabulous Freddie, who does artwork and all this type of stuff. There's loads going on. But the pages themselves are dense with text. And even though each book is about 90 pages, it does take a while to get through it, because every page is just stacked with information. Even though it might not look like it sometimes, there's still always something in the image or in the boxes to kind of just read and get together with it, because the pacing of it is really like, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. So it can be quite overwhelming with the amount of things thrown at you. But because I adore hip-hop music so much, to get a narrative of the formation of early hip-hop movements, so looking at Run DMC, looking at the Beastie Boys, looking at Grandmaster Flash and all these other people, it's just great for me, because you not only get the straightforward written account, you get these beautiful illustrations of these artists that made such an impact on the world, and you get illustrations of the streets they grew up on, the equipment they used, all of these things. And it's just mind-blowing how much work went into this. Ed Pisco really designed the pages, researched everything. And even at the back, you've got a bibliography that's quite chunky.
Yeah, it's a huge bibliography.
All of the different books and influences that he is saying, look, this is not me just saying one history. I've looked at this, and this, and combined and compiled this history from a multitude of sources. One of the things I love is how he depicts music as well, because this is probably the first book I read that try to visualize the sound of a room. And again, you might think, oh, that's really difficult to do. But he does it by using kind of line work and things like that. So you see this panel here now. You've got these 2 artists standing between these massive speakers. And it's messy because there's lots of lines coming off each character in each area, because the bass is shaking everything. And even in the second panel, I love this one.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I love that one. Because again, you just get in the Disco Brothers whacking out some tunes in a street party, the basses and the homemade speakers as well. It's amazing, made out of little dumpsters and stuff like that. It's amazing. And all rapping on the streets. And you get such an idea, a visual idea and a kind of historical idea of what went into hip hop and who was there, who were the main players, what is the story of hip hop from start to end, really. As I said in the beginning, if you were to take music away from a book, you wouldn't have nothing. Literally, a music is at the heart of this whole narrative. So if you were to take that away, you've literally got no story at all. But I think one of the other things that I love is Ed Pisco's clear admiration for music. Like, you can see that he loves drawing these figures from his past, the people who had influenced him, the people who kind of made an impact on his life. You can see how much he's enjoying kind of doing caricatures of people. And, even like taking a mick in sometimes, drawing them very weirdly and very caricature-like, but just again, meaning it in such a admiration way. He's got nothing but respect for hip-hop and that musical movement, and that comes across wonderfully. Yeah, it's a wonderful story. It really is. There's not that many speech bubbles and not that many conversations, because it is mainly kind of told through narrative kind of prose that this is happening, and then it's showing you a picture of it, which is similar to Beats. Beats has a real, not a lot of dialogue going on. This is what's happening. This is what's happening. So you might argue that there's a little bit of a disconnect between the text and or that it's too straightforward in terms of saying what's going on and then showing you. But again, the way it's done, it's just so enjoyable that I think you overlook the density of the page, the amount of information. Because if you are a music lover, you're just going to enjoy hearing that history, hearing the anecdotal history, seeing those people from history. I think Fantagraphics put out an omnibus version collecting all 4 volumes, but not in these sizes. I think these sizes...
Yeah, that's the way to go.
It is 100% the way to go. Very rarely would I see, a nice, well-crafted omnibus in hardback and go, oh, ignore that, but ignore it, get these.
The production quality, the design, as you mentioned, I think Ed Piscor was involved in all parts of it. I think the most obvious influence is on his grand design, which was influenced not just by the kind of historical archaeology that he did and then putting it together, but also that creating that yellowed paper and creating the sense of a comic, or almost on an extremely brown paper kind of thing.
The slipcase is a clothish bound slipcase, but he's even got you can probably see it slightly. There's browning and dirt on it.
Yeah. There's
the amount of times I've tried to clean this off is insane. I've gone up to it with a cloth and I go, what? Oh, there's mold on it. And I'm like, no, that's printed on there.
I think density is the perfect term for it, because that's what struck me about it, is that at first glance, it might seem like this is a collection of biographies. But then when I read it, I was like, I'm not sure if I would classify it that way, because, as you say, it moves from person to person and situation to situation with not just such speed, but the way it is distributed so much that he doesn't seem to be telling the story of people. He seems to be telling the story of a culture, of a movement. I gather you are a big hip hop fan, but my exposure to it has been very mediated by things like MTV and VH1. Like, what makes the chart? That's not what the book is about.
Really eclectic as well. 1 minute you kind of on tour with the band who have ended up in Scotland or something like that, and then you're bouncing back to Run DMC, as kids trying to get a record deal. And so you're flying around, and the main drive is, these are the bits of hip hop. These are the impactful moments of hip hop. From these little nuggets, everything grows. And so you keep following those nuggets further and further down the line. And I love as well that he's got a track listing at the back, because I actually went out of my way and made a playlist on my iTunes. And so the playlist as well, the track list that he's got goes in order of the narrative as well. So you could conceivably, whack that on and read that at the same time and kind of go through that. I've done that, but I got distracted listening to it and forgot to read.
Well, that's one of the problems is that are you usually a person, because I know people fall into different groups. Are you a person who has music on when they read?
No, I never do. A lot of people I know do. Admire them because I haven't got the concentration to do that. I'll fall into the music.
That's what happens to me. I don't admire them at all. I think they're not paying attention to one of the things.
I would be nice, but let's put them down. When I listen to music, it's got an intent to it. So I'm listening to it because I want to hear the words, I want to hear the vocals, or I want to hear the tune or the music. And it's the same with reading. And I want to read that. And anything else, it just messes me up getting into that intention. And so I think I'm just too single-minded.
It's the same thing with me, is I get distracted, and especially if it's music with lyrics, then forget about it. But even other music, it's like I'll start listening to the music. It'll sort of override. But for me, the idea of a playlist is interesting because I like to think about what the creator might have been listening to while they were doing this, and how they put it together and how they put it into their work, either literally or processing it in a particular way.
I'm positive that Ed Pisco probably would have had hip hop on when he was going down the road of writing this. It would blow my mind if he never did, really. There's a great little YouTube channel called Quick Sharp Reviews. I think he's an Australian guy. And at the end of his videos, he always gives the recommendation of what he listened to while reading it and recommendations of what to listen to. And that bit of the video, I'm always like, nah. I like the rest, but I'm not going to take your advice there because I am not listening to music, I'm reading.
I can imagine that if you're doing something that might be mechanical to a certain extent, where certain parts of drawing can be that way, and doing the dishes might be another way. I'm not equating the two, but that I think is a little different. But yes, I'm in the same boat as you, is that when I'm reading and I'm processing reading, there's something in my brain that's not going to be able to do that with music. But I know probably more people who read with music on than don't. So I guess we're in the minority that way.
I think we are.
Weird.
What is your next pick?
My next pick is my final biography, and my third biography is Glenn Gould, A Life of Tempo by Sandrine Revel, written and drawn. This is a biography of the pianist, performer, and composer, and done in a very, it's almost like a children's storybook style, and that's absolutely essential in certain cases, particularly when giving us young Glenn Gould, which we get in flashback and in fantasy. But it also has this approach to the page layouts that create these moments in which I really felt they were doing, the author, Sandrine Revel, was doing a fantastic job putting me in the shoes of this rather eccentric man. I didn't know much about Glenn Gould except that he was a celebrated pianist who stopped performing and went into composing. And why he stopped performing and what he wanted to do with composition makes up the most of this book. But as you can see from even these pages, this book is less interested in giving us incidents and more about the mood and the feel of what it was for this man who had this prodigious talent and who had this phenomenal capacity that most people couldn't understand, but at the same time applied that kind of incisiveness and that kind of analysis that he was able to do with music and movements to his own life and behavior, becoming someone who rejected performance, who hated audiences, who didn't like meeting with people and interacting with people. This is in direct opposition to what you were saying about Johnny Cash. Apparently, Glenn Gould's view was that you have the composer, the performer, and then the recording. And these have to come together in this sort of holy alchemy. Maybe alchemy is absolutely the wrong word. He approached it like a science. He approached it like maths. That's why I think, unlike the other biographies, even though they're stylistically very distinct, why this stands out to me is, as a biography, it's very much about inhabiting the skin of someone without trying to make them relatable. It's just a question of transportation. It's just a question of saying, who was this person and what was their approach to music? And this is where I find myself kind of fascinated by this book, because it's about classical music, and I know even less about classical music than I do about hip hop. But what the comic was able to do is that even if I don't understand it, it was able to create that context for me of saying why this was a sensation without ever spelling it out. It's a very complex thing, is that you get how revered he is, and at the same time, what kind of questions and doubts people have about him. You get all of that through his rejection of them. It's him arguing why he doesn't want to do something, and why, all these people who show up just to watch him play the same piece over and over again are not the way he's going to develop as an artist. So the storytelling being that complex and dense, while being in its presentation such a gorgeously but still spare presentation. There's a part in it in which this piano, the Steinway that he specially ordered and then has been tweaking and adjusting for years in order to get just the right kind of force feedback and the right tone, and he wants to marry the piano to the harpsichord. When that piano gets damaged and broken, this is how he is represented, where he falls and shatters, and the way it's fantastic. And it's just like, this is the kind of biography that really blew my mind, because instead of trying to make someone relatable and trying to find things in people that I would say, oh, I felt that, etc., it absolutely transported me into a very alien thought process, into, like, I wouldn't feel this way, but I could feel what that feeling that way means. It's that kind of thing that this book does throughout, and does it on such a difficult subject, and without being a musical expert, it makes me feel the importance and the significance of this kind of a life. I think that was the crowning achievement of this, something that I completely wasn't expecting. I don't know if I really got a sense of every chronological historical thing in his life, but I definitely got a sense of what his life was like, which I thought was just a fantastic achievement. So that's why that's my third pick in my top 5 music comics.
Not in any particular order, though.
Not in any particular order, but that is the last biography. I think in some ways, these biographies, they're not in an order of ranking, but they are in an order, I think, of style, where the Johnny Cash biography is perhaps the hardest and the starkest. And even though it's impressionistic, expressionistic, it feels like here we get into these moments, we get these scenes, we get what's happening, almost like a documentary, but with stylization. Then in The Fifth Beatle, you've got this gorgeous presentation, but it's keeping, again, the walls of reality around, but it's giving them this glow. And in this one, those walls are kind of, there's some osmosis going on. The things are bleeding back and forth between the interior and the exterior. So I liked approaching the biographies that way, where you're kind of losing the grasp of the real world a little bit with each one of these.
It looks really good, that one does, though. I love the little depictions of the hand movements and the way that the piano is kind of interacted with.
I think this is something that musicians would be able to say that, oh, that's the right chord and that's the right kind of thing. But there are areas in it where even someone as illiterate as me could hear the music and could feel the movement on it. This is one of the notable pages over here in which I don't know anything about form and the notes and the chords, but looking at this page and looking at this grid and kind of going the way we do from top to bottom, left to right, I get a sense of how far the hands and fingers are falling, where there is a softer thing, where it's harder. And I'm not sure where it comes from. It certainly doesn't come from any sort of musical knowledge or experience. That's just a small example of what this comic does over and over again. And it's very good at providing a certain context. In one of his first concerts, as a kid, he's sitting there and he played his piece as a soloist, and then he's waiting. The orchestra is playing, and he's waiting for his time to come back in. And apparently, you're supposed to keep yourself completely focused on the orchestra, and it's a big no-no to ever look away or break your concentration, because you've got to be counting and you've got to know when to come in. And then he gets paranoid about these dog hairs on his pants, and he starts brushing them off, and then he gets so frantic that he stands up to brush them off, and the entire crowd is like, oh my god, what a scandal. And I was just like, wow, that's a scandal. And it's like, this is ridiculous, he's lost his place. And then he's got to kind of guess at where he is, and he comes back and he sits down, and then his parents like breathe a sigh of relief, and then applause breaks out because he's found his place perfectly. And it's just done so wonderfully I take that as an example of me as a person who doesn't have any of this context. I wouldn't understand the formality of the situation or the difficulty of what it was that he was doing, but the storytelling is so clear, and that sort of transportation into his anxiety, the audience's chagrin, his parents' fury, and then the relief and the applause, it feels like the author has really conducted an orchestra over here. They've made all these pieces kind of play together. When you talked about Hip Hop Family Tree being the one book that you knew would make this list, this book was the one I knew would make this list. This is the first book I fixed on, because this is the book that makes me feel the music, not in that soundtrack sort of way, but what that music means to this person and how that music can be used in a very comicsy fashion. I don't think I've seen anything quite like this.
And it gives you a doorway into that musical genre that you know little of. And not even if you know the musical genre, you don't necessarily know the kind of things that go on behind, like you mentioned about, that cultural thing where, etiquette thing where you have to get up or not get up and have focus. So it kind of all shines a light on the musical format of that world overall, really, which is always great as a bonus. You're not getting just a biography or just, hearing music. You're getting kind of entrenched in the world that musician was part of.
Absolutely. And this is why music is such an interesting topic, because I wonder how much our own interests and our own knowledge affect our enjoyment of reading something. There are people, and I think we both talked about, like, Box Brown is one person who comes to mind. He writes about professional wrestling, and I'm not a fan of professional wrestling. But by the time I finished that, I seem to have made some headway. Those are the kind of things that I really appreciate. And that's why music is one of those things where I know so little about it from the point of view of being a music creator is concerned. I know so little about it technically. To me, the comics, because I know comics or I understand comics, what I'm looking for are things that will give me that kind of entry, that kind of access by being the vocabulary that I understand. But yes, I'd love to know what you think about it. And a pianist. So I guess the Beatles, we're just using them as a band. Hip Hop Family Tree,
which is loads of instruments.
That's just one outside of the instrument classification.
Just its own thing, beats. And then we've got piano's got to be
right. So
mainly
Silent Hell is a piano book, you would say. And I'd say Glenn Gould is definitely a piano book. And 2 guitars, 2 pianos, Beats and Beatles. That's 3 down, 2 more to go. What is your number 4?
2, don't screw up my list, man.
Right. In ranking order.
Exactly. This one's going to take some explaining to do, but it's 20th Century Boys by Naoki Urasawa. Now, for those who've read Naoki Urasawa, probably a lot of people have read Pluto, maybe Monster, or seen the animation of Monster, the anime. But this is an astounding read. It's captured over, I think, 11 volumes, and then another volume that's called 21st Century Boys, which wraps up the story. And I got these perfect editions, which are published by Viz Media. These books were amazing. I love the art of Naoki Urasawa. And essentially, this story, there's no way I can explain where this story goes to and the amount of stuff that happens to it. But I'll give you the basic premise of where it begins. It begins with a group of boys who, as young men, come out with, these very imaginative threats to the world, and they write narratives of dangers, and they are the heroes that solve these problems. So they live in this own world, their own little world where they create in fantasies. But as grown-ups, they see these fantasies that they vaguely remember from their childhood actually happening and coming about. And so what happens is someone from their past is basically taking the ideas they come up with as kids and putting them into place, because they kind of want to do what they fantasized as kids. And that person then wants to be the heroic figure that prevents all these world-changing events that he's going to start. But obviously, being kids' imagination, the things they're coming up with are involving, global pandemics, massive robots, loads of just mental stuff that kids would come up with randomly and then save the day. But all of these are happening. And one of the main characters is Kenji. And Kenji is our main character, and we catch up with him working in his mother's store, in Japan. Now, you could read this entire thing and really overlook one of the most kind of pivotal things about the book, really, which is the main heroic protagonist of the whole thing is essentially a musician and a guitarist. The whole idea of Kenji and his life, music defines everything about who he is. When he was younger, he would play guitar and listen to music obsessively, like in early flashbacks, because the book jumps between them as children and them as adults to try and piece together the story of who is doing all these massive things around the world and causing so many people to die and all these different things. And so as a child, he plays 20th Century Boy by T-Rex in the school. He loves musicians are his big admiration in life, and they've influenced him to play guitar, and playing guitar is the only thing that means anything to him. Now, Naoki Urasawa in real life is a guitarist, and music means the world to him. You'll probably find more videos on YouTube of Naoki Urasawa playing guitar than of drawing. He loves music. And if you've ever read Sneeze, which is a kind of small collection of his work, the majority of those shorter stories are him going to America and going to famous music venues and going on tours and stuff like that, because he just loves the music industry so much. And so he is basically inserted in this gigantic, vast, epic story. The one person that can stop everything happening and save the entire world is one man and his guitar. And so it's just, that on its own is amazing. But the other things that happen in this book are equally amazing, in terms of the music that Kenji comes up with becomes almost like a way of getting messages around the world and stoking the fires of rebellion. Because later on in the series, there's almost like a post-apocalyptic world that's been created by the events that's happened in previous volumes. And so instead of information traveling around via email or via post or anything like that, information is traveling around using music and using song. And so music becomes really emblematic of freedom in this book. And all from Kenji, he inspires other people with his own music to kind of, steel their nerve and fight till the end. Without music, for a start, and without musicians, you haven't got a main antagonist and a main character. You haven't got a way for the story to kind of come to a culmination and an end, because music is so integral to how the story culminates in the end. And so this book overall just blew me away, because I've never seen such an ambitious, science fiction story that's jumping all through all these different time frames, that's going in virtual reality, that's got big robots, that's going from childhood in ghost houses to the future, which is post-apocalyptic. And the thing that carries it all across is the one person that's going to stop it is one man and his guitar. And I could not pick it because of that, which is just amazing, I think. And that's why I picked it. But Naoki Urasawa's art is wonderful as well. For those who've never read any Naoki Urasawa, his work is wonderful. Pluto is probably my favorite, but like, look at this. Opening pages, you know, a little girl tied up scarily. And then why is she tied up and the record's coming in? She's tied up because Kenji wants to get his record on the school radio. So he basically whacks it out and then like whacks it over the airwaves because he believes, right, this school is too tight, it's too rigid, they're going to rebel, everyone's going to be on my side. All I have to do is play this. So he plays this song and nothing changes. but it doesn't deter him from believing the music can change the entire world. It's a fabulous story. If you love being kind of teased and having this vast mystery that spans over many, many decades and years, then this is the type of book for you. It's really easy to read as well, I think. And the mystery, the amount of red herrings you get for, you know, the main antagonist that's behind it all, the amount of red herrings, the amount of maybes, ifs, is frustrating, but beautifully frustrating. I never found myself like frustrated to the point of chucking the book across the room. I just wanted to go, you nearly did right. I'm going to call him up, you'll do it then. And yeah, without music though, it really loses something. And as a guitarist myself, I loved the fact that, you know, the main guy he is a struggling musician. You know, he busks on the street, he goes out and tries to earn money, but he basically earns all his money from working in his mother's shop. And so he's a frustrated musician, and he keeps his music and everything keeps being battered down. But then by the end of it all, his music is kind of what changes everything. And I love that narrative and story. It's great.
I often wondered, because I have not read 20th Century Boys. Pluto is one of my favorite science fiction comics. I love it. Urasawa's Monster didn't hook me. I wondered if 20th Century Boys was a reference to the T-Rex song, but I didn't know it was about music that integrally. Although what you're saying is that it's because the protagonist is a musician and that's sort of his vision of the music.
And you could read it all and you would go, and you may not even realize how integral music is because you're so focused on maybe some of the other characters or the overall mystery. But it's kind of, when you think about it, it really is a fundamental part of the whole narrative. This struggling musician finding his way through life and ending up having his music kind of be reinforced in such an amazing way by the end. It certainly isn't a backdrop of music or anything like that. It's very much all from him, but it shows how kind of music can travel, how it can influence people, how people can, you know, get inspired by protest songs and folk songs and things like that. It's really got a lot going on, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised that you were under the impression this would be a controversial pick. You make it sound like quite a natural fit.
Yeah, I made a good fight against him. A good argument.
Yeah, you don't need to convince me about Urasawa's skill. The only thing that I think is that, are the perfect editions out of print now and hard to find? Because I believe I might have slept on them a little too long. How many did you say perfect editions?
11, but technically 12. But I think the perfect editions are kind of out of print, but I think they've been back and forth in print. And so it's just a case of keeping an eye. But in general, I can't imagine, if they are hard to find at the moment, that they'll be out of print for long.
I'm definitely going to be keeping my eye out for that. Thank you. All right. So that was your number 2 pick. And my number 2 pick, moving on to the fiction, Ballad for Sophie, written by Philippe Mello and drawn by Juan Cavia. Philippe Mello, I believe, is a musician and a filmmaker, and Juan Cavia's art, both of whom I was introduced to by this book, is just lovely. But Ballad for Sophie is this sort of epic, decades-spanning book about pianists. So another one for the piano. Well, your last one was guitar.
My last one was guitar.
I
That's
know.
my number one, yeah, and that's definitely more piano.
Well, there you go. But Ballad for Sophie is, I think, a relatively new book. This might be the most new book on my list from 2020 in Portuguese, and I believe the English translation in 2021. And this is a story of two pianists, is the way that the back of it or marketing blurbs will make you think. But in reality, it's really the story of one pianist. It's the person over here. There is a second genius pianist. And this is a book, once again, in a pattern that I think I had an incorrect. This is why you should never read any sort of descriptions at all, because I read maybe one sentence and I don't want spoilers. So I had the notion that this was about dueling pianists and two pianists from 1933 and a life of competition or something like that. I created the movie The Prestige, but with pianists. But it's not like that. It is a rather emotional but beautifully told story in the writing and the art of life and loss and regrets, of talent and of ability, but also of privilege. But it's told in the form of an interview, and this woman with the orange hair is a journalist who's interviewing this old man who lives in this decrepit mansion stained with cigarette smoke. He's still chain smoking even though he's quite ill, and he has this housekeeper who takes care of him. And he's one of the best-selling record artists of all time. His records sold in the millions at one point of time, pop piano. But he's got these regrets and he's got this bitterness inside him. And over the course of this interview, we are given a series of flashbacks into his life and his rivalry, much of which might be only in his head. There's a type of storytelling that I think can be very easily sentimental. There's a definition that I often quote. Sentimentality is when the author is more enamored with something than the reader is. And I've always found that to be a good definition. Even a preponderance of sentiment does not necessarily cross over into sentimentality until you lose the reader. And this, I think, is where this book really shines, is where emotion and these kind of massive big things like lifelong regret and the price of success and the price of fame and the things we sacrifice, all of this sounds very emotionally weighty and very melodramatic, but the book just stays on this side of the melodramatic. Most of the time, I would say I was surprised by what comes up next in the book. In fact, from the beginning of the story, I would say the first 10 pages are the story that I would have thought the entire book would be. And it quickly moves beyond that and keeps complexifying, not in a plot way, but in a character and character intention sort of way. It keeps complexifying that story that it gave you. So you thought, here are two kids, they're in a piano contest, one of them wins, one of them loses. And these are the lives they go on to lead because of that contest. And while that is true, again, that happens in the first 10 pages almost. And then everything that you expect, everything that you believe a story like this would show you as contrast is kind of subverted or sidestepped, which I thought, in making a decades-long story about life and love and music, I thought that would be very difficult to do. And I was shocked at how well the writer and the artist of Ballad for Sophie were able to do that. And I don't want to make direct comparisons, but it feels similar to me to works like Day Tripper and Always Never by Jordi Lafebre, where there is this sentiment, there is this slight touch of almost even magical, wistful look, and you can get pain and you can get things that are not all happy and sunshiny, but they will have a warm glow about them, either of nostalgia or of bittersweetness. And that kind of tone, I think, is a very unique tone. I don't think everyone who attempts it is able to get that. And I think people either stray on the hard and gritty and sort of hard-bitten sort of because it's easier to do, and they kind of go for something more bombastic because it's easier to do. I think balancing between those two things of talking about things like sadness, talking about things like death and loss and regret without becoming maudlin or without becoming treacly is a tough balance. And I'm kind of a sucker for those kind of stories, the ones that just kind of toe the line, just thread the needle and do it without falling over to one side or the other. There's something fantastic about a more classical tragedy, which also has a tinge of happiness to it, or something that's eventually happy but comes from a much more wiser and older happiness than what you thought happiness was at a young age. Maybe it's a sign of age that those kind of stories really appeal to me these days. And once again, classical music and piano at classical music, competing pianists, and what makes expertise over there, the level of obsession and the level of talent and the level of hard work that it needs to do that, are things I don't know anything about. But to use them as metaphors for what we pay attention to, what we think our priorities should be, and then what really matters. And one other thing I remember I'd kind of forgotten about until you mentioned the writing of music. The author, being a musician themselves, has actually composed the ballad for Sophie of the title. And it's there in the book, and it can be played by anyone who can read it and play piano. So
Amazing.
Yeah, so after the story ends, the song is actually included in the book.
That's the classical version of Scott Pilgrim and the Sex Bombs.
Chords, yes, absolutely. So there you have it.
Would you want my first?
Yes, it was my number 2. So let's go for it. Your number 1, sir.
My number 1. Now, before I get to it, all 4 of the picks previous have kind of had different elements. 20th Century Boy had like this troubadour who was, going to change the world with his music and his attitude towards life. Hip Hop Family Tree is straightforward, biography on music and music culture. Black Sad was the backdrop was music. Scott Pilgrim, again, the backdrop was music culture and 90s kind of early 2000, band and garage band culture. This one kind of combines a lot of those elements and shoves them together in a nice package, really. Apart from 90s band culture. Monk. Now, it's also called Monk, Thelonious, Panacea, and the friendship behind a musical revolution. So, Monk by Yusuf Daoudi. I think that's how you pronounce it. This is by First Second as well, and it's a wonderful little hardback. When I picked this up, it kind of blew me away because I love Thelonious Monk's music. It was actually my first proper girlfriend introduced me to Thelonious Monk. She was a pianist and she loved his work. And I was like, who is he? And I started listening and I was like, oh, he's really good. And since then, I've kind of listened to lots of his albums back and forth over the years. It's not as fashionable nowadays, I don't think, jazz and music like this, because it lacks that lyrical content that a lot of people are after with music these days, because obviously it's mainly instrumental. But this book is doing a few things all at once. First and foremost, it's a biography of Monk and his life and who he was. But it's not told in that straightforward biography way. It's told by showcasing him alongside his friend, who is Panacea. And she is a member of the Rothschilds family. So she's a very wealthy woman, and she falls in love with the music of Thelonious Monk. And so she basically just attaches herself to him and never lets him go. And so it tells of that quite unique story of this very underappreciated for many, many years, very hard-working and very hard to deal with musical artist, alongside this very wealthy kind of, not aristocrat, kind of, what's that word they use for, a rich person in the metropolis and the city and all that? I can't remember. It'll pop into my head. But either way, she is part of that kind of wealthy class, and she really tries everything to keep him on the straight and narrow. So you get her story as well as his. And in fact, the book starts off, you know, when the narrative begins, starts off following her, you know, driving through, the radio being on, giving you an indication that it's during the Reagan administration and things like that. And she's speeding along in her car and going home. And when she gets home, you know, you see her home set up with a piano and records and all the memorabilia of her jazz music love. And then upstairs, sleeping in a locked bedroom, is Monk. And Monk is just listening to the distance, playing the piano that she's doing. And so the story starts off when Monk is kind of at the end of his tether, really. He's frustrated with music, he's frustrated with life, and he's kind of shut himself away from the outside world and just locked himself in a room in her house. And she's just allowed him to kind of crack on because she got such love and admiration for him. She just allows him and helps him in any way she can. But then we jump back to the past and to how he ended up as Thelonious Monk, you know, how his relationship began with this woman and how the two combined during the, you know, 40s and 50s to make a friendship that would last forever. There's even, for those who are interested in the Rothschilds, an amazing Rothschilds family tree showing where she sits in that vein and how she's so different from everyone else in terms of everyone else is very, you know, wealthy and elite, whereas she enjoys going out on the street, going to jazz clubs and listening to jazz, listening to trumpets, listening to that musical culture, listening to the manic city around her. And again, it visualizes the jazz scene in America so well. And one of the things it does amazingly well, right from the opening pages, is it kind of plays a soundtrack in your head. Like you get Thelonious Monk clicking his fingers, and then as you've turned the page, then he starts moving and dancing. And what he's doing there is he's not dancing to any song that's playing in the environment around him. It's all in his head. And this is what he's kind of, what comes from the book is the music is constantly in his head. He's constantly composing. You know, he's constantly going, oh yeah, keep that tempo up. Now take it down a bit. Now go to the minor chord, go to the major chord. And he's moving and he's creating and composing all his work without being on the piano. It's all just playing out in his head, you know, and the movement of him, you know, you can almost kind of hear the music, how he's moving. You can kind of visualize in your own head what the music is doing, when it's going up, when it's going down, when it's a beat, when it's not. And his enjoyment of it all as well comes across so well. But that's one of the parts of this book that I adore, actually, is that you get a real indication of how no matter where he goes, no matter where he is, music is just in his brain constantly. And this page kind of sums that up lovely. Like you got a total black background there with him talking and dancing and him, you know, going shubra, shubra, you know, all on his head, but then going, oh, wait a minute, I could do it this way instead, or B to the G to the D minor, then, oh, yeah, straight, no chaser, all this type of thing. But then the other page, then you realize that he's actually in the middle of the street in daylight and he's about to get run over. And that's so great a kind of way of depicting this guy, because it is in his own world and nothing else matters, only the music. Later on, he kind of knocks his friend up early in the morning and says, oh, can you let me in? And his friend goes, oh, it's 4:00 in the morning. And he says, yeah, I got a song in my head that I really want to kind of play out and get to. And you get this indication of an artist that is just both enriched and tortured by this music that he's constantly trying to get out of his system, constantly trying to perfect. And yeah, and the way that the music is depicted on the page as well, you can just feel that manicness in jazz and that craziness that comes from jazz. And the way that it depicts the jazz scene and jazz musicians is fabulous. But also you get all the ins and outs of this guy's life. You know, you get his relationship with his fans, with Panacea, with all these other people. But also you get this indication of how he creates music and the process he goes through. And why he's not successful, his drug use, his mental health issues, because clearly if a guy is that obsessed with sound and music, and cannot focus on anything else, then there's other issues going on. And he's so single-minded in many respects. But yeah, it's just a fantastic book, really. He visualizes his world around him like having bolts to the brain, when he has this amazing kind of, and his brain is kind of on fire, on lightning with like that thought. And when he's driving, he's kind of not even properly driving. He's crashing his car and stuff like that because he's not thinking of driving. He's thinking of music. And it's just a fantastic insight, really, into how a musician composes work, how they see and interpret the world around them differently to what a non-musician would, and particularly when it's such an obsessive thing as it is with Monk. You find how the people around them and closest to them are affected. You find bits about the music industry, about drug use, about racism. All of these things are dotted throughout this thing. And Monk certainly didn't have, the biggest, most highlighted career of any jazz musician. Like now, in hindsight, he's like one of the best. But in his lifetime, he wasn't consistently on the top. He was always having to fight for it and always exhausted by that fight. And this book really kind of brings that whole world to life. And that's why it's my number one, because it does everything all the others do and more, I think.
Right.
Yeah, there you go.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, this is a book that I absolutely need to get. It looks and feels like the kind of, like as you were saying, that putting you in his shoes or putting you in his skin, that's always the holy grail, so to speak. I've heard a lot of people discussing things, especially when it comes to artists with mental health issues. I've heard a lot of people discussing things as in like, without this, they wouldn't have been that. And that always seems a little reductive, or how do you know? And there are obviously people who push back against that. But I still think that without any prescription, without any saying that this is what it is for all musicians, or this is the way art is, you can still be honest about what it was for that person. And I think that's what really stands out to me about this book, that it doesn't seem to be about this is how one does music. It's about how this person saw the world.
Exactly right. And it does show other musicians who are just totally flummoxed by him, and his approach. I think Charlie Parker's in there and a few other musicians, and they just like, what are you doing? This is not how it should be done, but it's how he does it and his process. And the one thing that came across massively from the book is just exhaustion. I mean, it must have been exhausting being in that head and being in that headspace that's constantly on fire every minute of every day, and constantly reworking songs before they even physically impact sonically on the world around you. And that's one of the things that come across definitely, is just how exhausting it must have been to be in the head of Monk.
Right. And is there a depiction of the drug use being perhaps a form of self-medication, or is that just left to the reader?
A lot of that is left to the ambiguity. I think he's pulled over at various times for drug use, and the drug use in general is kind of more depicted as part of the culture, as part of that kind of cultural thing. But the other thing is, honestly, the relationship, like the panacea that she brings to it. She says statements like, music saved me. And so her role in this is really interesting, because she sees him and music as general as her savior, as her religion almost. It's that impactful for her. She really just, it fully constructs her own world around her love of music and her admiration of musicians and stuff like that, and particularly of him, because she goes to see them all. Being of wealth, she's going about meeting everyone, but there's just no one who's got that thing that really speaks to her on every level apart from Monk. And so that relationship really helps have a different perspective on her as well, because for the most part, the book shows you Monk's story through his own eyes. He's walking down the street, he's doing this, he's playing this song, he's composing this. So it's nice to have that character there to kind of give an outsider's perspective of him and what he's like to deal with as well. And so, it's really, I would definitely read it. If you can't get this as well, by the way, he has got another book that he didn't write, but he drew, and it's called Last on His Feet, the Jack Johnson's biography. That's really good as well. That's got lovely depictions of, how violent a life he would have experienced between this real visceral kind of reactions from the crowds and stuff. But he's also writing and finished, I think it's released in other languages, a book called The Giant, which is an Orson Welles biography, which I cannot wait for.
Right. Okay, I have to get caught up. But thank you for that terrific sounding recommendation. Yeah, I can see why that made you number one. If you're the kind of person who ranks books, I could see why.
And I am.
Yes. On the other hand, there's me who will say my final book.
On the fence, you are.
No. How can you rank art against art? It doesn't make sense.
You say that from the fence.
That's bad enough when we have to choose 5 and leave out a number of different things. I mean, you mentioned Harvey Pekar, and it seems almost a travesty to talk about music comics and not talk about Harvey Pekar, because he did so much writing, both in prose as well as in comics, on music and biographies of jazz musicians in particular. And one thing I almost did bring out, but I resisted, but I did almost bring out as an honorable mention, is an issue of American Splendor specifically called Music Comics. And it's Harvey Pekar working with Joe Sacco, who's the artist on, I think, all of the pieces in there from Joe Sacco's pre-Palestine period.
Yeah, what is Joe's book now about music culture?
But I like it.
Is that it? Yeah, I can remember. Yeah. I haven't read it myself.
Harvey Pekar hasn't and is not going to make this list. There are a number of comics that we could have mentioned and talked about, so it's hard enough to be down to 5. But my final book is Klezmer by Johann Sfar. I believe, unfortunately, that this also is the only volume. So you'll see that on the cover it says Book 1, Tales from the Wild East. So this is the only book that was brought out in English. There are other volumes in French, but they never got translated into English. But this is also, interestingly, published by First Second. So both of our final works ended up by the same publisher, which is quite a coincidence. But
yeah, we didn't plan that.
So when we do the publisher tally, First Second is suddenly going to come out of nowhere and have to do in there. Johann Sfar is the author, perhaps most famously, of The Rabbi's Cat, although he has done, I looked this up, he's done over 100 comics in French. So there's a lot of Johann Sfar to find. And I've really, really loved all of his work that I've encountered. So after The Rabbi's Cat, I went looking, and he's got collaborations with Emmanuel Guibert and with Louis Trondheim, and they've worked in children's books as well as in books for grown-ups. And it's funny because some of their children's books seem really dark and have adult themes in it, and some of their grown-up stuff has a lot of silliness and goofiness in it. It's a style that really works for me. But Klezmer is it's set in 1913, before the First World War, in Eastern Europe, and follows 4 Jewish characters and a Romani character who's referred to as Gypsy, and everyone says, uses the word Gypsy in this book, but they're all outcasts essentially at this time and place, and they're quite ostracized, and they all have different backgrounds. Some of them have darkness and violence in it. In fact, this book starts with a massacre of a bunch of musicians by another group of musicians, which I have to say really surprised me. I mean, it's pretty dark to have a band of musicians sitting around a campfire just gunned down. And it's another level for it to be done by another group of musicians in this world in which they're all sort of competing for the same audience. They're all competing for the same coins from the same villagers as they nomadically make their way around the country. So it has that kind of darkness and violence. But what is interesting about this book is that it also has this goofiness and this silliness, and these characters seem to react to the violence around them and then move on quite it's not like they make light of it. It's just like, this is life, and they learn and they adapt. And you'll see that the art style, Johan Svar has a loose art style anyway, but this is probably the loosest I have ever seen. I mean, these are squiggles that barely come around and complete each other. The paint kind of smooshes and smears all around in a very pleasing way, but I can see why someone would look at this and say, are these preliminary sketches, or is this just, someone trying to figure out what the story is going to be about? And with the colors as well. But what happens is this story of traveling musicians who are poor and hungry, but they come together. You get one couple in one area, and you get two other characters, and then you get a fifth character. And these two stories kind of converge at one point of time, and they become a band. And they start playing this music, which is drawing from the traditions they come from and drawing from their culture, but it's also mixing and matching with what they're doing. So I had no idea what klezmer music is. And after I read this, I went and listened to some klezmer music. It sounds chaotic, and it sounds loud, and it sounds like it's multiple instruments, but there's this energy and joy to it. And the style that this book is done in makes a little bit more sense to me, because it's just as chaotic. The storyline, the plot, whether it's veering from darkness to music, whether it's veering from lighthearted comedy to some serious thing and then back again. And also when it's showing you people from different backgrounds and people of, who are represented separately in different ways. So these two students expelled from a yeshiva for stealing look a particular way. This girl who has disguised herself looks a particular way. But when they come together and they start playing as a band, all of these styles and all of these colors sort of mush together to give you that band. And you can see all of the individual components of the band still exist. So it's the looseness of the lines and the looseness of the colors, the kind of smeary watercolor thing. All of it creates the sense of chaos and of this, where there are no boundaries and things bleed through, and there is no genre really. Like, is this serious? Is this comedy? Is this are they in danger? Are they about to triumph? All of these things can change on a page by page basis. Now, that's something I've really appreciated in comics like Donjon and Sardine in Space. Sardine in Space is for children. Donjon is for grown-ups. And at any point of time, you could kind of confuse them with each other. There's something about the way these artists work. Johan Svar, Louis Trondheim, Guiber, and to a certain extent, Fabian Wellman, with books like Beautiful Darkness and Satania. There's that kind of style that Karasoet. And these people, the works that they do, they're so weird and unclassifiable because they feel distinctly different from, say, an American style, in which what is for kids is very distinctly for kids, what is for grown-ups is very distinctly for grown-ups. But the reason why this is my final pick is because, like most of these other things, except for maybe a little bit of the Beatles and a little bit of Johnny Cash, it's about something I don't know anything about. And it takes a very unusual approach to have a period piece set in Eastern Europe. And the fact that it's incomplete in some ways, it ends on a cliffhanger with them going to play at somebody's house. And the last question is, who are we going to be playing for? I wonder who it is who has called us to their place. And the story ends there. And it's just like, it's literally a question that you're left with. And you're like, I want to know, because I've been following them in the countryside. I've been following them as they've been exposed to the elements and been set upon by people looking to rob them or hurt them. Now that they're finally playing as a band and they've gotten to the point where they're being asked and invited somewhere, that's where the story ends. So I really do want to continue with it. But in some ways, I really like the fact that I have that cliffhanger and I get this fragment of the story. It feels all right. It feels acceptable to me in some ways because it's such a loosey-goosey story, and it's so it's not heavy on plot, but it's heavy on the feeling of what's going on. Is that I'm fine with being shown a snapshot of these people coming together and and then maybe they'll have adventures, or maybe they'll become famous, or maybe they won't. But it's the origin story of this band that we're getting, but one of the most bizarrely and most difficult to understand kind of ways of creating an origin story that I've ever seen.
I love the title.
Tales of the Wild East.
Yeah, I love that play. Yeah, Tales of the Wild East. Yeah, I can't imagine there's many comics within that genre tackling that time period of music, because again, certain kind of people will look back, even if you're in Europe as well, and you'll inadvertently kind of focus on the big music movements in the kind of 20s and 30s. And I don't think that is it, because it's kind of almost like looking at folk music and kind of, early folk music in the Eastern European and trying to decipher what's happening with that and trying to look into it. And on the fringes of society as well, not like, big name acts for people who are kind of like trying to create something and go do gigs in like pubs or on street sides and theatres, and then just kind of slowly work their way up. So it's an interesting subject to tackle. The artwork looks lovely as well, I think.
Yeah, the artwork, I think, is obviously the reason why I picked this up, is because I wanted to read more Johan Svar. But what this does is also, it's one of those few comics that really captures singing for me, which is difficult to do. So when he's singing over here, so for the first 3 panels, it's him singing, and then she joins in. And she joins in with just that one word and the tune over there. And then she gets a little bit more confidence, and now she's singing alongside him. And then in the next one, she goes, "Do I sing well?" He says, "Don't ask yourself if it's good or bad, just sing." And then she continues singing, and he goes, "Sing louder, you have to make the crows fly away." It's just this sequence of them starting to sing together without historical context, without me knowing about the music, without me even knowing what the tune is. It really captured this essence of, as you were talking about with Monk, of the body language and the movement. But whereas with all the comics we've seen before, the line and the form has been so tight and it's been so evocative through its sequence, over here, the images are like the one image itself is a sequence, It's like it's got all the movement in it. It's got all the movement, including the movement of the air vibrating with the song. And that's the way it feels. And that's the way the colors feel to me. And it's that experience why I put this on my list, and why I think of this in such high regard, is that thing that we were talking about. The difficulty or the complexity of depicting music on page is something that this rises to the challenge of in a very unusual way, in a different way. When I think about something like Ballad for Sophie and the way it represents music, it's got a sense to it where, just like what we've seen before, we can see what it is. It's a piano. A person sits at the piano. People are watching him. He starts playing. You see their reaction. I mean, it's gorgeously done, but it's something we understand. It's almost cinematic. We can see it as a movie scene. Whereas with Klezmer, it looks like no movie. As I say, some people might actually object to looking at stuff like this, but this is how I think something that is textual and visual can somehow become audible to me. At least it's a way that it can, which I think that this book does really well, which is why it is my 5th and final pick for top 5 music comics. Wow. So we did it. It only took us 2 hours and 45 minutes.
What other books do you think people would pick?
I think we will have at least 1 or 2 people asking for Murder Falcon.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Really?
100%. That was what I was literally like, I was going to get my fall up, look.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to double check one of the panels where he is playing music and kind of like fighting against the world and the powers that be coming in. But yeah, Murder Falcon's definitely going to be some people saying, because it's a power. Music is like a power that is being used.
Yeah, and it's something that I think even when you were talking about 20th Century Boys, I was trying to think about like, we've seen this before in other forms. We've seen a man with a guitar. Yeah, maybe it's El Mariachi, but Is there something in which the guitar itself is a weapon, something older? I don't know. Maybe it was a cartoon I watched when I was young or something like that. But it seems to me that music as a power.
Well, obviously, if Black Bolt was to sing, then we got some issues there.
Thank you so much, Chris, for joining me. I had a great time, and I'd love to have you back for more such discussions. They don't all have to be 3 hours. Maybe we can ask our viewers to give us some suggestions.
Yeah, that would be really good.
And I believe I was quite restrained in my lack of honorable mentions.
Just one? Yeah, you did really well.
I want to be properly credited for that.
You should be. You should. Comments, make sure that you highlight, how proud you are of Anshuman for not digressing into a litany of other honorable mentions.
Can you imagine what it would have been if I wasn't kept on that straight and narrow?
Yeah, that's why I said not to do it.
Well, next time we're going to pick a top 3.
Good plan.
But thanks so much, Chris. It was a pleasure having you here. And thank you, everyone, for watching. This has been For the Love of Comics with Off My Shelves. And I'll see you with the next video.
Thank you.